Of course, this is an opener for discussion. It's not. I first found myself confronting this question about 10 years ago, when I was much less involved in education, and I looked at it as a provocative question. But then the years passed, and the more I look at it, and the more I think that actually it's a critical question, it's a necessary question. It's really important to re-ask it, because I will say one. So I will look at two main aspects within the question. Very simply, how did we arrive to the current form of education and the idea of education? This will be very, very fast. And the second aspect, which is into which future we are educating. Can we consider it a continuity, or should we look at it as a discontinuity? Now, concerning the idea of formal education, first of all, it is one of the oldest traditions, funnily enough. Of course, it was related to a very small percentage, but there are records from the very beginning of writing language from the Middle East. And since then, there is plenty of different kind of traditions where education has evolved differently, but always in correlation with abstract thinking or the development of new technologies that needed learning. So it's writing, it's social technologies, religion, moral, coordinated production, administration. In the beginning, it's mostly based on the texts that were there, which were either religious or administration. And they served a need for social function, but also, of course, distinction of social caste and role, complying with the authority, and employing different types of discipline. Now, when we come to the last century, it's important to note that actually in less than 1 century, education moved from something that was about 2% of the world population to today, which is in 2020 around 90% of the world population primary education, 60% secondary, 40% tertiary, which means that along 1 year, we educate more people than in all of human history, which is an interesting level of impact. So now the question that I'm going a bit free on this, and are we looking at a product of history, or are we looking at a product of insight? So of course there have been plenty of studies that already identified all kinds of agendas within this expansion and big jump of systemic education. Among them, the need to standardize for maintaining empires or nations, or to provide for factory working condition. So it was a lot about order, obedience, reliability. It was based upon discipline. But we also know that if it is something that it lasted that long across human history, there is probably some very relevant advantages to it, which mean it does make a significant difference. And I would rather say, this is at least the way I look at it, that education is the human first enhancer. By that I mean that it's actually what connects us or what gives us access into the huge cultural potential for evolution that our species, our society has, and it shouldn't be underestimated. And also studies that are being done in the last decade are showing that actually education produce even some neural structure transitions, which are interesting. So now the question that I'm left with is how to tease out the difference between the historical that comes with all kinds of agenda that might be extremely not relevant, together with aspects that have to do with enhancing human condition and cognition and intelligence. So, for example, this is just to briefly mention some of the paradoxes that we have. So are we educating an individual, functional member of society? Are we speaking about collaborative intelligence or going with the herd? Is learning reflective challenge, or is the cause for lost interest? Are we in touch with creativity? Are we following instruction? And so on. There are many like it. So I did a I began with building a distinction for me to try and answer this question. What you see here is 4 different aspects. There is the I, which here I'm looking at it as a living organism. And in a way, this drawing, it's inspired by the work of Maturana. It looks like the autopoietic cognitive loop of the living organism. So there is a living organism, an I, which interacts with the world. While interacting with the world, it influences it, and at the same time, it gains insight about the world and about itself. And so I have here 4 aspects that I kind of artificially distinguished between them: the self, the world, insight, and influence. But once I have them like this, I can also say that they are kind of interacting between them. And so I have this aspect of interaction between the self and the world, between the insight and influence, which I can also relate to the aspect of gain, which is what I understood my conversation with Sasha, that is actually what is going on as the first role of the Buckminster, which is very interesting. So in which fashion the game of interaction between the self and the world co-define both of them, or allows to co-discover both of them, and in which fashion the interaction and game between gaining understanding and gaining influence is interacting there. Now, it can be, of course, at the level of the physical, of the abstract, of the reflective. It's just as if more layers are added to this. I will come back to it in the end in a more defined fashion. So the graph that we just saw, I said it's being inspired by Maturana, and another aspect of the theory of autopoiesis is defining living as a process of cognition, which means that we need to do nothing in order for it to be a process of cognition, by the simple fact that living in the world is the way that we create it moment by moment. And this, in the way that I understand it as of today, implies also that by the simple fact that we are living in the world, we continuously modify it. And we modify all of the environments in which we live. So for a moment, it might be relevant, specifically when we ask this question of education, what for, to kind of take a step back and to reapprehend what is the habitat in which we exist. And is there a difference. I look at it across my life, but of course, I'm inviting everybody, and it's a much wider question and reflection upon it. So I think the comic is self-explanatory. Yes, we have modified the physical environment to a level and to an exponential fashion which has no precedent in our history. And the same goes for the social technological in which we exist, as well as the knowledge ecosystem, the level to which we are connected in a global set of networks, and of course the personal environments which are growing with technology, with science, with increasing design and production. By the way, this year I just found out it's the first time that the built environment, so everything which is built and produced, is overtaking in amounts, in mass, all of the organic material on the earth. Of course, these are guesses, but they are very well computed guesses. So we are at a very critical kind of threshold. It's a world profoundly different from the one we grew up in terms of population, in terms of life expectancy. Along my life, population doubled twice, which is almost, it was surprising to look at it. Life expectancy doubled in the last century. The level of urbanization, of course, all the rest, climate change. But most importantly, I think that education, the way that I went through it, it was kind of world. And as of today, we are in a very different situation. The material limitation, the planetary boundaries, which were first raised in the 70s, but nobody really expounded long enough on it, as of today are part of the state of affairs. So we have this graph of exponential change, which can be applied to many different dimensions of our life, and for sure will be applied to everything which is from here on. So I'm giving now an example. I am teaching a course on sense making to university undergraduates, and along the course I decided to put the class into an experiment. Let's try and make sense of let's make a research and find leverage point for what concerns fake news, which is something that in a way is rather recent phenomenon. Of course, conspiracy exists in our history for many. And when we start to look at it, yes, of course, there is the internet infrastructure, there is the fact that smartphones are correlated to it, there is the WhatsApp small groups, which are a big part of pushing it on, and then in some fashion there is how all of this is changing the way we communicate with each other. And then, you know, it begins with the decentralization of communication with the internet, but at the end of the day, we find out that there is a very strong centralization, which is brought on by the business, by the ads, by the big corporates that are now running the tools with which we navigate the internet. And of course, the entry of the algorithms and the way that we do not really understand how they modify how they manipulate for it, our attention. And this is bringing us, of course, to the fact that it impinges upon times in which trust is a bit being eroded in politics and globally. and then you have radicalization. And so we started with something which was, conspiracy about celebrities, but we end up with something which is strongly real and has a very realistic impact upon the world. Now, this is a very complex kind of environment to navigate, and I am working with the undergraduates. They're not children, while everybody that is a teen as of today, it's actually swimming within this. And what we're seeing here, it's just, I'm showing it very shortly. One of the students was doing some kind of analysis of how she fell for one of the fake news. And the interesting point was that at a certain point, she started to do decision according to basic common sense. But then she asked herself, okay, but what is common sense within this environment? Because it's not the same common sense that we use in the social. So this only to say that when we come to reapprehending our habitat, I think we really need to consider that we exist in a completely new habitat. And in a way, it's a good exercise to look at it as a completely new world that we need to learn how to navigate. We need to understand how to deal with its uncertainty. We might have to redefine what is truth, what is not, what is that we want to call truth. And another aspect, which is really interesting within the current state of affairs, is this need to circulate one voice, which I don't think was part of previous generations. If you are upon a social media, you have this need all the time to circulate a voice. And so even this might be, if I go back to this simple example, not so simple example of fake news, part of the engines that allow someone to just click and forward. So if we are speaking of a new habitat, then the next question is, okay, so what is the kind of intelligence that we need? Because we are speaking a lot of intelligence when it's spoken about cognition, when it's spoken about education, but intelligence has been defined for a particular kind of world. And if we are looking at a different kind of world, we should reconsider also this concept and understand what does it mean to compute decision within this kind of wide systems, what are the relevant configurations in which we can sustain this kind of intelligence, and how can we, make it accessible. So, of course, we have 20 minutes. I'm not into answering this. This is a very short diversion, which is, we all know, I think, in this forum, what is self-organization. But to give this kind of input that intelligence itself can be understood as a self-organizing phenomenon, meaning a self-organizing quality that we cannot fully define, but it's strongly determined by what does it interact, what are the changes in the environment that are triggering the system to reorganize itself. And what is the kind of, and this usually happens when there is a threshold of degree of complexity that push the system to reorganize itself, to kind of find its next dynamic equilibrium where it can sustain. So this is an example from also, it's about 10 years ago, but I find it enchanting. I don't know if you know the story, but it's Sugata Mitra. He is a computer programmer that was working in India. He was the very expensive quarter, but they were confining on one of the walls with the slams. So he decided to open a hole in the wall and to place there a computer and just to leave it there open and accessible. And they run this study by now in a number of developing nations and for many years. And they have noticed that actually without saying absolutely anything, just leaving there the computer, the mouse, the keyboard, children come, they are very interested, they start to interact with each other, they teach each other English, they learn things which are so-called extremely complex for them, but after a month or two, they're actually already a mini school teaching from the one that learn to the one that are not yet learning what does English means and how to play and how to come to the video games. And they repeated this experiment also by giving them to learn very difficult biological kind of knowledge, and they always get to the same result of how the children somehow manage to organize both a group, a type of interaction, and a very fast kind of learning that brings them to very impressive results, very short. So first of all, I think it's an interesting point of reflection. Again, I am not advocating for going with the hole in the wall, but there is something else that emerged from it. I don't know if it's directly correlated. Back then, when Sugata Mitra was presenting their experiment, they also provided a small guide of how to apply it in school. And I found myself in one school and I applied it, and it was actually very interesting. And the principle of it is to come to the children with some kind of phrase, which is very attractive, but also very mysterious, and to ask them to go and to search what does it mean and why it means this, and to bring the whole theory behind. And in elementary school, it actually brings a very interesting result. At least this was my experiment back then, of course, a very local one. But as of today, you have what is called the learning pit, which is indeed presenting the students with some kind of question to which they do not know the answer and letting them work it out. I don't really think it looks the way it looks here, because this is very individual, and I think that the process, the way it works, demands a class and demands the confusion, demands the discussion, the presentation. But there is this idea of managing to engage someone with something that is important enough to trigger the process of learning, which is very different from just teaching it. This is also, I think we're around. Marta, how long do I have?
Yes, it's past time already. So.
Okay, so I will jump this, if you allow me. Okay, so these are the few things with which I re-emerged on the other side. What ignites engagement is something which I hear a lot everywhere. How to recalibrate this relation, intelligence, individual, collective, how to use the group, how to use the class. And also the need to reconsider the role of top-down and bottom-up processes in the organization of knowledge, because yes, of course, the internet brought us fake news, but it also brings us fantastic endeavors, Wikipedia, Linux, open source. So there is this aspect of how the top-down and the bottom-up need to find a way. Now, a few lines that I took, if I call the question, okay, so it's a new habitat, so now are we going to navigate it? there is where to take. This is taken from one, it's Education for the Future, 1999. He gives 7 main lines. They are a bit, so it has to do with detecting error in the approach to knowledge. So this ability to understand that knowledge is never perfect, it's never absolute truth. Pertinence of knowledge, knowing the human condition, one should be introduced to it. The planetary era, which this is very different, the awareness to planetary limits and the legacy of the last century, understanding each other, confronting uncertainties, and the democratic dialogue. So this I am just mentioning because I think not necessarily it's about teaching it, but it carries a number of attitudes which can be interesting while thinking about it. And this is just to to close with this. If I play again, and this again, I am putting here just as a discussion sketch. It's nothing more than this. But let's say that I go with the aspect of the self and the way it interacts. I would like to see there, yes, of course, the persona, the embodied, the individual, but also the human. If the human, then the humanity. And I think that we need to introduce here life in the sense that I am a live organism, so it goes all the way from me to life at large. And then when I go to the world with which I interact and I learn from, so of course the other, but then all the environment, so the habitat, the context, and we have to somehow give space to everything that has changed in the, and will continue to change, because whoever, in a way, whoever will learn needs to build this thing to keep on learning on a continuity, because it's not about learning a fixed map and it's not about learning a given word. We are within something that is in change. And then influence, it's all about agency. So to introduce this kind of improving mindset, making it meaningful by myself, applicabilities of my abilities, and of course, the pleasure of gaining understanding of abstraction, self-learning, respect, and wonder, knowledge production. Okay, that's, I think, the rush through the opening of the question.